Sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come from the loneliest hearts. When old mountain trapper Silas Vane pulled a drowning wolf pup from the floodwaters of Thunder Valley, he had no idea he was about to discover something that would change everything he believed about the wild. Silas lived alone in the high ridges, graying at the beard and long past wanting company. He hadn't held anything tender since his boy died 15 years back. But that storm-swollen evening, hearing that little pup's cry, something stirred in him. He saved the creature without thinking twice. Days later, something impossible happened. An entire wolf pack appeared at his cabin. They didn't come to attack or threaten. They came to stand guard. What would make wild wolves protect one grieving old man? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Thunder Valley like an old man's breath in winter, rolling down from the high peaks where Silas Vane had made his home for the better part of 4 decades. His cabin sat tucked into a grove of ancient pines, weathered logs dark with age and countless storms, the roof patched with tin sheets that caught the early light like scattered silver coins. Smoke curled from the stone chimney he'd built with his own hands. Back when those hands were steadier and his heart still carried hope for the future, Silas stepped onto his porch, coffee steaming in a chipped ceramic mug that had belonged to his late wife, Martha. The valley spread below him like a living map of memories. The creek where he'd taught his boy Tommy to fish. The meadow where Martha used to gather wildflowers for their kitchen table. The logging road that had claimed his son's life in a moment of twisted metal and shattered dreams. At 68, Silas carried the weight of those losses in the stoop of his shoulders and the careful way he moved. As if sudden movements might crack what remained of his world, the cabin itself told the story of a man who'd once planned for a family. 3 bedrooms, though only one had seen use in 15 years. A kitchen table built for 4 that now held only his plate and cup. Shelves lined with books Martha had loved, poetry and novels he couldn't bring himself to read but couldn't bear to give away. In the corner sat Tommy's old guitar, strings long since broken, gathering dust like everything else that once brought music to this place. Silas had been a logger once, like his father before him, working the steep slopes of Thunder Valley when the timber industry still thrived in these parts. His hands knew the weight of an axe, the song of a crosscut saw, the satisfaction of a tree falling exactly where he'd planned. But after the accident, after watching them pull his boy from that crumpled logging truck, he'd walked away from it all. Took up trapping instead, selling pelts to the few buyers who still came through Widow Crow's trading post down in the valley settlement. It was solitary work, which suited him fine. Days could pass without hearing another human voice, just the wind through the pines and the distant call of hawks riding the thermals. He knew every trail within 20 miles, every creek crossing and hidden spring. The mountains had become his cathedral, vast and silent, offering a kind of peace he couldn't find anywhere else. But peaceful didn't mean easy. Winters up here could kill a man if he got careless. Silas had learned to read the weather in the color of the sky, the behavior of animals, the way the wind shifted through the trees. He kept his cabin stocked with enough supplies to last months, his root cellar lined with preserves and dried meat, his woodshed packed tight against the cold. Self-reliance wasn't just a virtue in these mountains, it was survival. The folks down in the valley settlement knew Silas by reputation more than acquaintance. He'd come to town maybe once a month, trading pelts for supplies at Widow Crow's place, exchanging nods with the few old-timers who remembered him from before. They respected his privacy, understood the kind of grief that drove a man to seek solitude in the high country. There was an unspoken code among mountain folk. You minded your own business and helped when asked, but you didn't pry into another man's wounds. Widow Crow herself was about the closest thing Silas had to a friend, though neither would have used that word. Elena Crow had run the trading post for 30 years, ever since her husband died in a mining accident. She was sharp as a steel trap and twice as reliable, with grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to see straight through whatever front a person might put up. She'd known Martha and Tommy, had watched Silas transform from a laughing family man into the quiet ghost who haunted these ridges. "You're getting too thin. Silas Vane," she'd tell him whenever he came to town, though she never pressed food on him the way some women might. Elena understood that some kinds of care had to be offered sideways, with respect for a man's pride. The trading post itself was a relic from another era, its wooden floors worn smooth by generations of boots, shelves stocked with everything from ammunition to canned peaches. The old-timers gathered there on winter evenings, sharing stories and complaints about the weather, the government, the way the world seemed to be changing faster than they could follow. Silas rarely joined these conversations, but he listened from the edges, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of their talk. There was Jake Morrison, who'd worked the same mining claim for 40 years, and still believed he was one good strike away from striking it rich. Pete Hawkins, a former forest ranger who knew every inch of the wilderness and could predict weather patterns 3 days out. Old Carl Brennan, who'd been fighting the same battle with arthritis for a decade, but still insisted on doing his own firewood every fall. These men understood the mountain code, independence tempered with quiet loyalty. Strength measured not in what you said, but in what you endured. But even among these kindred spirits, Silas felt the weight of his difference. They had their stories of hardship and loss, but they also had their small victories, their ongoing battles, their reasons to keep moving forward. Silas felt like a man suspended between worlds, too hurt to fully engage with life, but too stubborn to give up entirely. His daily routine had become a kind of meditation, repetitive and comforting in its predictability. Up before dawn, coffee on the porch while he planned his day. Check the traps along the northern ridge, following trails he could walk blindfolded. Repair gear, process any catches, tend to the small chores that kept his world functioning. Evenings by the fire, reading from one of Martha's books, or simply watching the flames dance while the mountain settled into its nighttime quiet. The loneliness was a constant companion, familiar as an old coat. Some days it felt like drowning, a weight that pressed against his chest until he could barely breathe. Other days it was almost comfortable, a buffer between him and a world that had proven capable of taking everything he held dear. He'd made peace with it, or thought he had. The way a man makes peace with a permanent injury that never quite stops aching. But if 15 years of solitude had taught Silas anything, it was that the mountains had their own ways of surprising a person. The weather could turn in minutes, revealing beauty or danger in equal measure. Animals appeared and disappeared like spirits, following laws older than human understanding. And sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark and the stars seemed close enough to touch, he could swear he felt something watching from the tree line, patient, knowing, waiting for something he couldn't name. It was this sense of watchful presence that had been growing stronger in recent weeks, though Silas couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was the unusual behavior of the local wildlife, deer moving through his territory in patterns he'd never seen before. Maybe it was the way his old dog Ranger, a blue heeler mix who'd been his only companion for 8 years, had started acting nervous. Ears pricked and hackles raised at sounds only he could hear. Ranger was getting on in years. His muzzle grey and his movements stiff with age, but his instincts remained sharp. When he fixed his attention on the forest with that particular intensity, Silas had learned to pay attention. The dog seemed to sense something stirring in the deep woods, something that made him pace the cabin at night and whine softly at the door. "What is it, boy?" Silas would ask, scratching behind the dog's ears. But Ranger could only offer the kind of knowing look that animals give when they're trying to communicate something beyond human understanding. Standing on his porch that particular morning, coffee growing cold in his hands, Silas felt the familiar weight of another day stretching ahead. The sky held the grey promise of weather, clouds building over the peaks in ways that suggested the season's first serious storm might be rolling in. He'd need to check the traps before the weather turned. make sure his gear was secure and his cabin ready for whatever the mountains decided to throw at him. But there was something else in the air that morning, a quality of anticipation that made the hair on his arms stand up. Ranger felt it too, standing at the edge of the porch with his nose raised to the wind, every muscle in his body alert and waiting. Neither man nor dog could have known that by evening, the careful order of Silas Vane's solitary world would be forever changed, that the storm approaching from the west would bring more than just rain and wind, that before the night was through, the loneliest man in Thunder Valley would discover he was not as alone as he believed. The mountains, it seemed, were about to remind him that kindness, like water, always finds a way to flow toward those who need it most. The storm hit Thunder Valley like the wrath of an angry god, turning the normally peaceful creek into a raging torrent that swept away everything in its path. Silas had seen mountain storms before, had lived through blizzards that buried his cabin to the windows and wind that stripped bark from trees. But this was something different. The rain fell in sheets so thick he could barely see his own hand stretched in front of his face. And the thunder crashed with such violence that the very ground seemed to shake beneath his feet. He'd brought Ranger inside when the first lightning began to dance across the peaks. And now the old dog huddled by the fireplace, panting with anxiety. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault, wind driving rain against the windows with the sound of thrown gravel. Silas moved through his home, checking for leaks, adjusting pots and pans to catch the drips that always found their way through the old roof during storms like this. The power had gone out hours ago, not that he relied much on the electrical grid anyway. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the fire in his stone hearth provided both warmth and light. He'd been through this routine countless times over the years, weathering nature's fury in the solid shelter he'd built with his own hands. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the storm seemed personal, as if the mountains themselves were trying to tell him something. Around 10 o'clock, the creek that normally babbled peacefully past his property began to roar. Silas pulled on his heavy rain slicker and stepped onto the covered porch, peering through the darkness toward the sound. What he saw made his blood run cold. The water had risen at least 8 feet above its normal level, carrying with it a debris field of broken trees, boulders, and God knew what else. The wooden bridge he'd built across the creek, sturdy enough to support a truck, had vanished entirely, swept away like kindling. He was watching this destruction with a mixture of awe and concern when he heard it, a sound that cut through the storm's fury like a knife through cloth, high and thin and desperate, barely audible above the wind and rain, but unmistakably the cry of something alive and in mortal danger. Silas strained to locate the source, his weathered face turned into the driving rain. There, caught in the beam of his powerful flashlight, something dark struggled against a massive piece of driftwood that had lodged against the rocks where his bridge used to stand. The current was trying to tear it free, and when it did, whatever was trapped there would be swept downstream into the deeper gorge where nothing survived the rapids. He didn't think. 15 years of careful isolation, of protecting himself from caring too much about anything, fell away in an instant. Silas grabbed a coil of rope from his porch and plunged into the storm, Ranger barking frantically behind him. The rain hit him like icy bullets, soaking through his slicker in seconds. But he pressed forward toward the swollen creek. The footing was treacherous, rocks slick with mud and debris scattered everywhere. Twice he slipped and nearly went down, saved only by grabbing onto tree branches or boulders. The roar of the water was deafening now, drowning out everything except that thin, desperate crying that seemed to pull him forward like a rope around his heart. When he reached the creek's edge, he could see clearly what was trapped in the driftwood. A wolf pup, maybe 3 months old, its dark fur plastered against its small body, yellow eyes wide with terror as the current tried to claim it. The little creature was caught by one hind leg, pinned against the logs, but unable to free itself. Every few seconds the entire debris pile would shift and groan, threatening to break apart and carry the pup to certain death. Silas secured one end of his rope around a sturdy pine and tied the other around his waist. The creek was moving too fast and running too deep to simply wade in. He'd have to time this perfectly or risk being swept away himself. He was 68 years old, not the strong young logger who'd once danced across floating timber with the confidence of youth. But looking at that terrified pup, trapped and helpless, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, the overwhelming need to save a life. He entered the water slowly, fighting the current that immediately tried to knock him off his feet. The cold was shocking, even through his heavy clothing, and the force of the water was far greater than he'd anticipated. Step by careful step, he worked his way toward the debris pile, using his rope and whatever handholds he could find to keep from being washed downstream. The pup saw him coming and increased its struggling, perhaps sensing rescue or simply terrified by this new threat. Silas could see that its hind leg was wedged deep between two logs, and the more it fought, the tighter the trap became. He'd have to calm the creature somehow, get it to trust him enough to stop fighting while he worked it free. "Easy there, little one," he called out, though his voice was nearly lost in the storm. "Easy now. I'm here to help." Whether it was his tone or simple exhaustion, the pup stopped struggling and fixed those golden eyes on his face. In that moment, Silas felt something shift inside his chest, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart, letting in a flood of feeling he'd forgotten he was capable of. This tiny creature, no bigger than a house cat, was looking at him with complete trust, betting its life on the kindness of a stranger. Working carefully, Silas managed to reach the debris pile and get his hands on the trapped leg. The logs had shifted to create a narrow vise, but there was just enough give that he could work the pup free if he was patient. He talked to the little wolf the entire time, his voice steady and reassuring, despite the chaos around them. "That's it. Easy does it. We're going to get you out of here, I promise. Your mama's probably worried sick, isn't she? Don't you worry. Old Silas is going to take care of you." It took nearly 10 minutes of careful maneuvering, but finally the pup's leg came free. Silas scooped the exhausted creature against his chest, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat through his wet clothing. The little wolf didn't struggle or try to bite. It simply pressed against his warmth and let out a soft whimper that broke. His heart all over again. Getting back to shore was even more treacherous than the journey out. The pup's weight threw off his balance, and the current seemed determined to claim them both. Twice the rope saved them from being swept away, and once Silas lost his footing entirely, going under for several terrifying seconds before the line pulled taut and hauled them back to the surface. By the time he finally collapsed on the muddy bank, both man and wolf were exhausted and shivering. Silas lay there for a moment, feeling the solid earth beneath him. The pup curled against his chest, still whimpering softly. Ranger had come down from the cabin and was dancing around them anxiously, unsure whether to be excited or worried by this turn of events. "Come on, boy," Silas gasped, struggling to his feet. "Let's get this little one inside before we all freeze to death." The walk back to the cabin felt like miles, though it was only a few hundred yards. The storm was beginning to ease slightly, but the rain still fell in steady sheets and the wind still howled through the trees. Silas clutched the pup against his chest, feeling its small body trembling with cold and shock. He'd saved its life, but now what? He knew nothing about caring for wolf pups, had no idea what they ate or how to keep them healthy, but those were problems for tomorrow. Tonight, all that mattered was getting the little creature warm and dry and safe. As he climbed the steps to his porch, Silas realized he was crying, tears mixing with the rain on his weathered cheeks. For the first time in 15 years, he was bringing something living and helpless into his home. For the first time since Tommy's death, he had something that needed him to survive. Inside the cabin, he toweled off the pup with gentle hands, checking for injuries and finding only minor scrapes and bruises. The little wolf submitted to his ministrations with surprising patience, as if it understood that this strange human had saved its life and meant it no harm. When Silas set it down near the fire, the pup curled into a tight ball and promptly fell asleep. its tiny chest rising and falling with the deep rhythm of exhaustion. Silas changed into dry clothes and made himself a cup of coffee, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline and cold. He sat in his chair by the fire, watching the sleeping pup and trying to understand what had just happened to him. In saving this small creature, he'd felt more alive, more purposeful than he had in years. The wall around his heart hadn't just cracked. It had developed a gaping hole that let in all the messy, painful, wonderful complexity of caring about something other than his own survival. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, 3 living creatures, a man, a dog, and a wolf pup, shared the warmth of fire and the quiet miracle of being alive in a world that often seemed determined to crush such tender mercies. Silas had no way of knowing that this simple act of rescue would set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the wild and his place in it. The mountains, it seemed, were just getting started with their surprises. Dawn came quietly to Thunder Valley, the storm having blown itself out sometime before sunrise. Silas woke to find pale golden light streaming through his windows and the pup still curled by the dying embers of his fireplace. The little wolf had barely moved all night, exhausted from its ordeal, but now it lifted its head as Silas stirred, those amber eyes tracking his movements with alert intelligence. "Morning, little one," Silas said softly, his voice rough with sleep. "How are you feeling today?" The pup struggled to its feet, favoring the leg that had been trapped, but managed to stand without obvious distress. It was a beautiful creature, Silas realized in the morning light. Dark grey fur with silver highlights, a compact body that would grow large and powerful given time. But right now, it was just a baby, maybe 12 weeks old at most, separated from its pack and entirely dependent on his care. The reality of what he'd taken on hit him as he prepared his morning coffee. He knew virtually nothing about wolves, beyond the basics any mountain man learned through observation. They were predators, intelligent and social, living in complex family structures that humans barely understood. This pup belonged in the wild with its own kind, not in a cabin with a lonely old trapper who hadn't cared for anything smaller than himself in decades. But looking at the little creature now, watching it explore his cabin with curious nose and cautious steps, Silas felt something he'd almost forgotten existed, responsibility that didn't feel like a burden. The pup would need food, water, warmth, medical care if its injuries proved more serious than they appeared. More than that, it would need companionship, guidance, the kind of patient teaching that prepared young things for the harsh realities of survival. His first challenge came within the hour. The pup was clearly hungry, making soft whining sounds and nosing around the cabin as if searching for food. Silas had no idea what to feed a wolf puppy. His own provisions consisted mainly of canned goods, dried meat and simple staples, nothing suitable for a creature that in nature would be nursing from its mother or beginning to sample regurgitated meat from adult pack members. He tried offering small pieces of jerky soaked in warm water, but the pup sniffed at them without interest. A bowl of milk from his stores met with similar indifference. Growing concerned, Silas finally warmed some beef broth and mixed it with mashed canned meat, creating a gruel that seemed to appeal to the hungry youngster. The pup ate eagerly, making small growling sounds of satisfaction that reminded Silas powerfully of Ranger as a puppy. Speaking of Ranger, the old dog had been remarkably patient with their unexpected guest. He'd spent the morning observing the pup from a respectful distance, tail wagging tentatively whenever the little wolf looked his way. There was none of the territorial aggression Silas might have expected. Instead, Ranger seemed to understand that this was a baby in need of protection, not a threat to his position in the household. After breakfast, Silas carried the pup outside to survey the storm's damage. What he saw made him whistle low under his breath. The creek had receded to near its normal level, but the landscape bore scars that would take years to heal. Trees lay uprooted across the valley floor, their massive root systems clawing at the sky like desperate fingers. Boulders the size of automobiles had been moved like pebbles, creating new channels and pools where the water had carved its violent path. His bridge was gone completely, along with a section of the road that connected his property to the main trail down to the valley settlement. He was effectively cut off until he could rig some temporary means of crossing, which meant no trips to Widow Crow's trading post for supplies. Fortunately, his stores were well stocked, and he'd weathered longer periods of isolation without difficulty. The pup seemed fascinated by the outdoor world, its nose twitching at every scent carried on the morning breeze. Silas set it down carefully, keeping one hand ready to snatch it up if it tried to wander too far. But the little wolf stayed close, exploring the immediate area around the cabin. With the cautious curiosity of youth tempered by recent trauma, it was while watching the pup investigate a particularly interesting cluster of wildflowers that Silas noticed the tracks, large paw prints in the soft mud near his porch, too big to belong to any dog, and arranged in the purposeful pattern of something that had been circling his cabin during the night. Wolf tracks, definitely, but from an adult animal, probably several adult animals. Judging by the various sizes and the overlapping patterns, a chill ran down Silas's spine as he studied the prints more carefully. The tracks came right up to his porch steps, close enough that the wolves could have looked through his windows if they'd wanted to. But there were no scratch marks on his door, no signs of aggressive behavior, just the methodical circuit of animals who had been watching, waiting, perhaps trying to determine what had happened to the missing member of their family. He scooped up the pup and carried it back inside, his mind racing. If the pack was looking for their lost youngster, they would be back. Wolves were notoriously protective of their offspring, and they had the intelligence and persistence to track their missing family member across considerable distances. The storm might have temporarily disrupted their search, but it wouldn't stop them for long. The question was, what did they want? Were they planning to reclaim their pup, possibly seeing Silas as a threat to be eliminated? Or was something else going on, something that might explain the strangely non-aggressive nature of their nighttime reconnaissance? Throughout the afternoon, Silas found himself looking out his windows more frequently, scanning the tree line for movement. The pup seemed to sense his unease, staying closer to his side and occasionally looking toward the door, as if it too felt the presence of watchers in the woods. Ranger paced restlessly, his ears pricked and his attention focused on sounds only he could hear. As evening approached, Silas faced a difficult decision. The logical thing would be to put the pup outside, let nature take its course, and avoid whatever confrontation might be brewing with the adult wolves. The little creature was strong enough to survive now, its injuries minor, and its family was clearly looking for it. Releasing it would be the sensible choice, the safe choice. But when he looked at the pup, now curled contentedly in a nest of old blankets by his fireplace, Silas realized he couldn't bring himself to do it. In less than 24 hours, this small creature had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead forever. The protective instincts, the gentle patience, the simple joy of caring for something vulnerable and trusting, all of it had come flooding back like water through a broken dam. More than that, he was beginning to suspect that the adult wolves weren't planning an attack. Their behavior the previous night had been too controlled, too purposeful for simple aggression. They had circled his cabin, yes, but they hadn't tried to break in or even shown themselves. It was as if they were observing, evaluating, trying to understand the situation before making any decisions. As darkness settled over Thunder Valley, Silas prepared for another night of uncertainty. He checked his rifle and made sure it was loaded, though he hoped desperately he wouldn't need to use it. He built up the fire and settled into his chair with the pup on his lap, feeling the small creature's warmth and trust like a benediction against his weathered hands. Ranger took up his position by the door, alert and watchful, but not showing the signs of fear or aggression that would indicate immediate danger. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, the lonely man, the faithful dog, and the wolf pup that had somehow found its way into both their hearts. Outside, the mountain night settled into its ancient rhythms, full of sounds and silences that spoke of life continuing in ways both mysterious and profound. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin's circle of light, patient eyes watched and waited, following laws older than human understanding. The second night brought visitors. Silas heard them before he saw them, the soft whisper of paws on wet earth, the barely audible displacement of air that spoke of large bodies moving with practiced stealth. He'd been dozing in his chair by the fire when Ranger's low whine brought him fully awake. The old dog stood rigid by the window, hackles raised but tail neutral, showing wariness without outright fear. The pup, which Silas had taken to calling Scout in his mind, lifted its head from where it had been sleeping and let out a soft yip that seemed to carry volumes of meaning. Not distress, not fear, but something that sounded almost like recognition. Moving slowly, Silas rose from his chair and approached the window. What he saw in the pale moonlight made his breath catch in his throat. 3 large wolves stood in his yard, positioned in a rough semicircle around his cabin. They weren't slinking or prowling. They simply stood there, motionless as statues, their attention focused entirely on his home. The largest was a magnificent silver-grey male, easily 120 pounds, with the bearing of an alpha accustomed to command. Beside him stood a smaller female, her coat darker but marked with the same silver highlights that distinguished Scout. The third wolf was younger, probably a yearling, with the rangy build of an adolescent still growing into its strength. They made no aggressive moves, showed no signs of preparing to attack. They simply watched, and in their patient stillness, Silas sensed something that defied everything he thought he knew about wild predators. There was intelligence in their positioning, purpose in their presence, but also something that looked disturbingly like respect. Scout had struggled to its feet and was now pressing against the window, whining softly. The sound carried clearly in the still night air, and Silas saw the female wolf's ears perk forward in response. The pack had found their missing member. There was no doubt about that. But instead of demanding its return, they seemed content to simply know it was safe. For nearly an hour the standoff continued. The wolves maintained their vigil while Silas watched from his window, hardly daring to breathe. Occasionally, one of them would shift positions slightly or turn their head to scan the surrounding forest, but their primary attention remained fixed on the cabin. It was as if they were standing guard, protecting rather than threatening. Finally, as the moon began to set behind the peaks, the big male gave what appeared to be a signal, a subtle shift of his head, and the 3 wolves melted back into the forest as silently as they had appeared. Silas remained at the window for another hour, but they didn't return. The morning brought a discovery that deepened the mystery even further. Lying on his porch steps, arranged with what could only be described as deliberate care, were 3 fresh trout, not dropped or scattered as they might be if carried by scavengers, but placed side by side with their heads pointing toward his door. The fish were beautiful specimens, still bright-eyed and firm, caught within the last few hours. Silas examined the gift, for he had no doubt that's what it was, with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. He'd heard stories from old-timers about wolves displaying unusual behavior, instances of cooperation between humans and wild animals that sounded more like folklore than fact. But this was happening to him, in his own yard, with evidence he could hold in his hands. Scout showed intense interest in the fish, sniffing them eagerly and making small sounds of excitement. When Silas cooked one of the trout for breakfast, the pup ate with obvious relish, confirming what he'd begun to suspect. These weren't random gifts but deliberate offerings, payment or tribute for his care of their young family member. Over the following days, the pattern repeated. Each night, the wolves would return to their silent vigil, maintaining their respectful distance but making their presence known. Each morning would bring some token. More fish, sometimes rabbits or other small game, always fresh and always arranged with ceremonial precision on his porch. Silas began to understand that he had somehow become part of something larger than simple rescue and recovery. The wolves weren't just grateful for his care of Scout, they had accepted him, temporarily at least, as a member of their extended pack. The gifts weren't payment, but participation, the sharing of resources that characterized wolf family dynamics. The realization brought both wonder and responsibility. If the pack had claimed him as one of their own, what did that mean for his future? What obligations came with such acceptance? And most importantly, what would happen when Scout was old enough to return to the wild? These questions occupied his thoughts as he went about the daily routine of caring for his unusual charge. Scout was growing stronger each day, its injuries healing cleanly and its appetite increasing. The pup had claimed a spot by the fireplace as its own territory, but it also followed Silas around the cabin with the devoted attention of a shadow. When he worked outside, clearing storm debris or tending to essential maintenance, Scout would lie nearby, watching everything with the intense curiosity of youth. Ranger had fully accepted the little wolf as part of their household, even beginning to engage in gentle play when Scout felt energetic enough. The old dog's patience was remarkable, allowing the pup to climb on him and nip at his ears, with the tolerant indulgence of a grandfather entertaining a grandchild. But it was the growing bond between Silas and Scout that surprised him most. He found himself talking to the pup constantly, sharing thoughts and observations he'd kept to himself for years. Scout was an excellent listener, responding to his voice with head tilts and soft vocalizations that seemed almost conversational. The little wolf had even begun bringing him gifts, small sticks, interesting stones, a bedraggled feather from some unfortunate bird, presenting them with the serious pride of a child showing off prized possessions. On the fourth night after the pack's first appearance, something changed. Instead of maintaining their distant vigil, the three wolves approached closer to the cabin, not threateningly, but with the careful deliberation of diplomats seeking an audience. The big male stopped just at the edge of the porchlight's reach and did something that made Silas's heart skip a beat. He sat down and looked directly at the window where the man stood watching. There was communication in that gaze, unmistakable even across the species barrier. The wolf wasn't looking at him as prey or threat or even obstacle. He was looking at him as an equal, a fellow parent concerned for the welfare of a young one. In those amber eyes, Silas saw intelligence, gratitude, and something that might have been an invitation. Scout had been watching too, pressed against the glass and whining softly. When the big male settled into his sitting position, the pup did something extraordinary. It looked back at Silas and then at the window, as if asking permission for something both man and wolf understood without words. The message was clear. The pack was ready to reclaim their member, but they were asking rather than demanding. They were giving Silas a choice, honoring the bond that had formed between human and pup, while acknowledging their own parental rights. It was a moment of such profound respect between species that Silas felt tears prick his eyes, but he wasn't ready. Not yet. Scout still favored its injured leg slightly, and the little creature had only just begun to trust completely. More than that, Silas wasn't ready to let go of the joy this small wolf had brought back into his life. The pack seemed to understand his hesitation, for after several minutes of patient waiting, they withdrew to their usual distance, resuming their protective vigil without apparent offense. That night, as Scout slept peacefully by the fire and Ranger dozed by the door, Silas sat in his chair and contemplated the strange turn his life had taken. A week ago, he had been the loneliest man in Thunder Valley, cut off from the world by grief and years of deliberate isolation. Now he found himself at the center of an interspecies alliance that challenged everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between wild and tame, human and animal. The wolves had given him a gift beyond the simple daily offerings of food. They had given him time. Time to heal old wounds through the act of nurturing new life. Time to remember what it felt like to be needed, trusted, loved without condition. Time to discover that even the most careful walls around the heart could be breached by something as simple as a baby's cry in the storm. But time, he knew, was not infinite. Soon he would have to make choices that would define not just his future, but the future of the remarkable little creature that had wandered into his life and changed everything he thought he knew about himself. 2 weeks into this strange new arrangement, Silas made a decision that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. He decided to venture down to the valley settlement, bringing Scout with him. The pup had grown stronger and more confident, its leg fully healed and its appetite voracious. More importantly, Silas had questions that only Widow Crow might be able to answer. And the isolation was beginning to feel less like sanctuary and more like cowardice. He rigged a makeshift crossing over the still swollen creek using ropes and fallen timber, a precarious bridge that would serve until he could build something more permanent. Scout rode in a canvas sling across his chest, bright eyes taking in everything, with the intensity of youth discovering the world. The little wolf showed no fear of the journey, seeming to understand that they were embarking on an adventure together. The walk down to the settlement took nearly 3 hours, longer than usual due to storm damage and the care required to navigate with his precious cargo. But Scout proved to be an excellent traveling companion, alert and curious, but content to let Silas manage their passage through the difficult terrain. Widow Crow's trading post stood exactly as he remembered, weathered wood and practical construction, with smoke rising from the chimney and the familiar signs of life that marked it as the unofficial heart of their small mountain community. But when Silas pushed through the door, with Scout still nestled against his chest, the usual comfortable murmur of conversation died instantly. 3 men sat around the old pot-bellied stove, coffee cups forgotten in their hands as they stared at the wolf pup with expressions ranging from amazement to alarm. Jake Morris and Pete Hawkins and Carl Brennan, the same old-timers who'd been sharing stories and complaints in this spot for decades, looked as if they'd seen a ghost walk through the door. Elena Crow emerged from behind the counter, her sharp eyes taking in the situation, with the quick assessment of a woman who'd seen everything the mountains could throw at a person. But even she paused when she got a clear look at Scout, her weathered features showing the first genuine surprise Silas had seen from her in years. "Well," she said finally, her voice carrying its usual dry humor despite the circumstances. "That's not something you see every day, Silas Vane. Mind telling us how you came to be carrying around a wolf pup like it was your own grandchild?" The story came out slowly, with frequent interruptions and questions from his audience. Silas told them about the storm, the rescue, Scout's recovery, and the strange behavior of the adult wolves. He kept his tone matter-of-fact, letting the events speak for themselves without embellishment or interpretation. But even told plainly, the tale sounded like something from a different world. Pete Hawkins, who'd spent 40 years in the Forest Service and knew more about wildlife behavior than most university professors, shook his head repeatedly throughout the telling. "I've never heard of anything like this," he said when Silas finished. "Wolves bringing gifts? Standing guard? It goes against everything we know about their territorial instincts." "Maybe," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "But maybe we don't know as much as we think we do." She approached slowly, letting Scout sniff her hand before gently scratching behind the pup's ears. The little wolf accepted her attention with the easy confidence of youth, showing none of the fear or aggression one might expect from a wild creature. Carl Brennan, who'd been unusually quiet during the story, finally spoke up. "My grandfather used to tell stories like this," he said slowly. "Old Lakota tales about wolves and men making treaties, sharing territory, helping each other survive the hard times. I always figured they were just stories, legends from before the tribes got pushed out of these mountains." "Your grandfather was a wise man," Elena said. "Maybe wiser than we gave him credit for." She studied Scout with the careful attention of someone evaluating livestock, but her expression was gentle. "This little one's healthy, that's certain. Good weight, bright eyes, alert as anything. You've done right by him, Silas. The conversation continued for over an hour, with each man contributing observations and theories about what might be happening up in Thunder Valley. Jake Morrison suggested that the pack might be testing Silas, seeing if he could be trusted as an ally during the harsh winter months ahead. Pete thought the behavior might be related to some disruption in their normal territory, forcing them to adapt their survival strategies. But it was Elena who voiced what Silas had been thinking, but hadn't dared to say aloud. "Could be," she said, "that they're not trying to get their pup back at all. Could be they're trying to place him with someone they trust to raise him right." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. The possibility that the wolves might be deliberately entrusting Scout to his care, rather than simply tolerating his temporary custody, changed everything. It suggested a level of intelligence and planning that bordered on the supernatural. But it also offered an explanation for behavior that otherwise made no sense. "That's a hell of a responsibility," Pete said quietly. "Raising a wolf pup to adult, teaching it to survive in the wild while keeping it connected to human companionship. Not sure it's ever been done successfully." "Maybe it has," Carl said. "Maybe those old stories my grandfather told weren't legends at all. Maybe they were history, passed down from a time when the boundaries between wild and tame weren't so clear-cut." Silas listened to their discussion with growing unease. The practical part of his mind recognized the enormous challenges involved in what they were suggesting. Wolves weren't dogs, despite their common ancestry. They had different needs, different instincts, different ways of relating to the world. Could he really provide what Scout would need to grow into a healthy adult wolf? More troubling was the question of what kind of adult Scout would become. Raised by humans but genetically wild, accepted by neither world completely, the pup might be doomed to a kind of permanent exile that would serve no one's interests. The kindest thing might be to return Scout to his pack now, while he was still young enough to fully reintegrate. But watching the little wolf explore the trading post with fearless curiosity, seeing how easily he accepted attention from strangers, Silas felt his heart rebel against the logical choice. Scout wasn't just any wolf pup. He was the creature who had awakened something precious in a lonely old man's heart. He was family now, in ways that went deeper than species or genetics. Elena seemed to read his thoughts. "Don't overthink it, Silas," she said gently. "Sometimes the best choices are the ones we make with our hearts instead of our heads. That little one chose you as much as you chose him. Trust in that." As if summoned by her words, Scout looked up from his exploration and made his way back to Silas, pressing against his leg with the absolute trust of a child seeking comfort from a parent. The simple gesture settled something in Silas's chest, easing doubts he'd been carrying for days. The journey back to the cabin was peaceful. Scout sleeping in his sling, while Silas navigated the familiar trails with renewed purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever questions remained unanswered, he was committed now to seeing this through. Scout was his responsibility, his privilege, his unexpected gift from a storm that had taken so much else away. That evening, as the three wolves resumed their nightly vigil in his yard, Silas stood at his window with Scout in his arms and made a silent promise to both the pack and the pup. He would do everything in his power to honor the trust they had placed in him. He would learn what he needed to learn, adapt what he needed to adapt, become whatever kind of parent this remarkable creature required. The mountains had given him a second chance at love, disguised as a half-drowned wolf pup crying in the storm. He wouldn't waste it. The first real test of Silas's commitment came 3 weeks later, when Scout's wild instincts began to assert themselves in ways that no amount of human love could completely suppress. The pup had grown considerably, its legs longer and its chest deeper, hinting at the powerful predator it would someday become. With that growth came behaviors that challenged everything Silas thought he understood about raising a young wolf. It started with the hunting attempts. Scout had progressed from playful stalking of leaves and shadows to serious efforts to catch the chipmunks and squirrels that frequented the area around the cabin. Silas watched with mixed feelings as the little wolf demonstrated instincts that were both beautiful and troubling. The perfect patience of a natural predator, the explosive speed of an animal designed to kill, the focused intensity that spoke of intelligence far beyond that of any domestic dog. When Scout successfully caught his first chipmunk, the mixture of pride and concern in Silas's chest was almost overwhelming. The pup had done exactly what nature intended, displaying skills that would be essential for survival in the wild. But seeing those tiny fangs pierce flesh, watching the methodical way Scout consumed his prey, reminded Silas forcefully that he was not raising a pet, but a predator. More challenging were the behavioral changes that came with Scout's growing confidence. The little wolf began testing boundaries in ways that would have been merely annoying in a dog, but carried different implications for a creature that would eventually outweigh Ranger by 50 pounds and possess jaws capable of crushing bone. Scout's playful nips grew harder, his wrestling matches with Ranger more intense, his vocalizations more complex and demanding. The howling started on a Tuesday evening in early October. Silas was preparing dinner when Scout raised his young muzzle toward the ceiling and released a sound that made every hair on the trapper's arms stand up. It wasn't the full-throated song of an adult wolf, but it carried unmistakable notes of wildness, longing, communication, connection to something beyond the warm circle of human companionship. The response was immediate. From somewhere deep in the forest came answering calls, the adult pack acknowledging their young member's voice with harmonies that spoke of family bonds older than civilization. Scout listened with rapt attention, his ears pricked forward and his entire body trembling with excitement. When the singing faded, he looked at Silas with an expression that seemed to ask permission for something the man couldn't provide. That night, for the first time since the rescue, Scout refused to sleep by the fireplace. Instead, he stationed himself by the door, whining softly and pawing at the wood with increasing frustration. The adult wolves maintained their usual vigil, but their positioning had changed. They were closer to the cabin, more visible in the moonlight, as if extending an invitation that grew more urgent with each passing hour. Silas sat in his chair and watched the struggle playing out in his young charge. Scout was caught between two worlds now, domestic comfort and wild heritage pulling him in opposite directions. The little wolf clearly loved his human family, enjoyed the warmth and security of the cabin, but he was also beginning to hear the ancient songs that called to something deeper than conscious choice. The internal conflict was painful to watch. Scout would approach Silas for comfort, pressing against his legs and seeking the gentle scratches behind his ears that he'd come to love. But minutes later, he'd be back at the door, drawn by instincts that no amount of human affection could fully satisfy. It was like watching a child torn between parents, unable to choose without betraying one side or the other. The situation came to a head the following evening, when Scout managed to push open the cabin door while Silas was distracted with cooking. By the time the man realized what had happened, the young wolf was already halfway across the clearing, racing toward the tree line, where the adult pack waited in the shadows. Silas's heart stopped as he watched Scout reach the edge of the forest and pause, looking back at the cabin with obvious uncertainty. The big alpha male emerged from the trees, moving with the fluid grace of perfect predatory confidence. He approached Scout slowly, touching noses with the youngster in a greeting that spoke of deep, familial bonds. For a moment, Silas was certain he was about to lose his unusual companion forever. The scene was too perfect, too natural, the young wolf reuniting with his birth family, returning to the world where he truly belonged. It would be the right thing, the natural thing, even if it broke an old man's heart in the process. But Scout surprised him. After several minutes of intense communication with the alpha, touches, sniffs, and vocalizations that carried complex meanings, the young wolf turned and trotted back toward the cabin. He paused at the porch steps and looked back at his pack family, then up at Silas, as if making a choice that required approval from both sides. The alpha male watched this exchange with the patience of a leader accustomed to complex family dynamics. When Scout settled at Silas's feet, the big wolf gave what could only be described as a nod of acknowledgement. The message was clear, the choice had been made, and it would be respected, at least for now. But the incident left Silas deeply shaken. He'd seen how easily Scout could slip back into his wild heritage, how naturally he communicated with the adult wolves, how conflicted he remained about his divided loyalties. It was a reminder that love alone might not be enough to bridge the gap between species, that some bonds ran deeper than conscious affection. Over the following days, Silas began to modify his approach to raising Scout. Instead of trying to suppress the pup's wild instincts, he started encouraging controlled expressions of them. He taught Scout to hunt cooperatively, showing him how to track and flush game while maintaining the discipline to respond to human commands. He encouraged the howling sessions, even joining in with his own rough approximations that seemed to delight the young wolf. Most importantly, he began spending more time outdoors with Scout, teaching him the skills he would need to survive in the wilderness while maintaining their emotional bond. They practiced tracking together, learned to read weather signs, studied the complex social cues that governed interactions between different species in the mountain ecosystem. It was during one of these educational expeditions that Silas discovered something that changed his understanding of the situation entirely. While following a game trail deep in the forest, they came across clear evidence that the adult wolves had been hunting in coordinated groups, tracks and signs that suggested they were deliberately driving prey toward areas where Scout and Silas were likely to be. The implications were staggering. The pack wasn't just tolerating Silas's role in Scout's education, they were actively supporting it, using their superior knowledge of the territory to provide learning opportunities for both human and wolf. It suggested a level of cooperative intelligence that challenged everything conventional wisdom taught about wildlife behavior. That evening, as Scout practiced his howling skills and the adult pack responded with encouraging harmonies, Silas felt a shift in his perspective. He wasn't just raising a wolf pup or maintaining an unusual friendship with wild predators. He was participating in something unprecedented, a true partnership between species, based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the welfare of a young life that belonged to both worlds. The mountains, it seemed, were teaching him that family could take forms he'd never imagined, that love could bridge gaps he'd thought impossible to cross. All it required was the wisdom to adapt, the courage to trust, and the patience to let relationships develop according to their own natural laws rather than human expectations. Standing on his porch that night, watching Scout play with moonbeams while the adult wolves maintained their protective vigil, Silas felt a peace he hadn't known since before Tommy's death. He was home, not just in the physical sense but in the deeper understanding that he belonged to something larger than his own grief and isolation. The loneliest man in Thunder Valley had discovered he was never truly alone. He'd just been looking in the wrong places for the family that had been waiting for him all along. The truth came to Silas on a crisp November morning, delivered by an unexpected visitor who changed everything he thought he understood about his situation. Dr. Sarah Running Bear arrived at his cabin before dawn, having hiked through the darkness with the sure-footed confidence of someone who knew these mountains as well as he did. She was a wildlife biologist from the university, but more than that, she was the granddaughter of the same Lakota. Elder Carl Brennan had mentioned weeks earlier. "Mr. Vane," she said as Silas opened her door to find a compact woman in her 50s with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical braid. "My name is Sarah Running Bear. I believe we need to talk about the wolves." Scout, now nearly full-grown and magnificent in his thick winter coat, emerged from behind Silas and studied the visitor with keen interest. Dr. Running Bear looked at the young wolf with an expression of recognition that made Silas's blood run cold. "You know him," Silas said. "Though it wasn't really a question. I know his bloodline," she replied. "May I come in?" What I have to tell you will change how you understand everything that's happened here." They sat around Silas's kitchen table while Scout lay nearby, his attention divided between the stranger and the familiar sounds of the adult pack moving through the forest beyond the cabin. Dr. Running Bear accepted coffee but declined food, her manner suggesting someone who had traveled far to deliver urgent news. 15 years ago, she began, there was a logging accident in this valley. A young man named Tommy Vane died when his truck went off the mountain road during a storm. Silas's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "That's my boy. But I don't see what that has to do with—" "Your son didn't die alone," Dr. Running Bear interrupted gently. "The official reports never mentioned it, but there was a pregnant wolf with him. She'd been struck by his truck just before the accident, probably trying to cross the road to reach her den. Tommy stopped to help her, even though he was already late and the storm was getting worse." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He'd read the accident report dozens of times, memorized every detail of those final moments, but no one had ever mentioned a wolf. "How do you know this?" "Because my grandfather was part of the search team that found them. He was still a young man then, working with the Forest Service. He found Tommy's truck, and he found the wolf nearby, dying but still protecting a single surviving pup. Your son had wrapped the little one in his own jacket, probably trying to keep it warm." Silas felt the world tilt beneath him. The image of his boy in those final moments, dying himself but still trying to save a helpless creature, was almost too much to bear. "The pup survived thanks to Tommy's kindness. My grandfather took it to the pack that claimed this territory, made sure it was adopted and raised properly. That pup grew up to become the alpha male you've been seeing around your cabin." The revelation shattered everything Silas thought he understood about the past 6 months. The big silver-gray wolf who had been watching over Scout, who had orchestrated the strange gifts and protective vigils, that was the creature his son had died trying to save 15 years ago. "The pack remembers," Dr. Running Bear continued, her voice soft with respect for the magnitude of what she was revealing. "Wolves have long memories, especially for acts of kindness. When Scout's mother died in the recent floods and he was separated from the pack, the Alpha didn't just tolerate your rescue. He guided you to that exact spot. The storm, the timing, even the debris pattern that trapped Scout, none of it was coincidence." Silas stared at Scout, seeing him with new eyes. This wasn't just any wolf pup he'd saved from the flood. This was the descendant of the creature his son had died protecting, brought to him by forces that defied rational explanation. The pack hadn't been testing him or evaluating his worthiness. They'd been repaying a debt of honor that stretched back 15 years. "My grandfather called it the Great Circle," Dr. Running Bear said. "The idea that kindness given freely will always find its way back, even across generations, even across species. Tommy saved a life, and now that life's family has saved something precious in you." The weight of realization settled over Silas like a heavy blanket. Every moment of connection with Scout, every gift from the pack, every instance of their respectful cooperation, all of it had been orchestrated by creatures who understood debt and honor in ways that humbled human pretensions to moral superiority. "But there's more," Dr. Running Bear said, her expression growing serious. "The pack is in trouble. Climate change, human encroachment, disease, their numbers are dropping dangerously low. They need genetic diversity, new blood, expanded territory. They've been hoping that Scout, raised with human understanding but retaining his wild heritage, might become a bridge between their world and ours." "A bridge?" Silas asked, though he was beginning to understand. "An ambassador, a wolf who could help establish peaceful coexistence between the pack and the human communities that are expanding into their territory. Scout has learned to trust humans because of you, but he's also maintained his wild instincts because of his pack. He's uniquely positioned to negotiate between both worlds." The implications were staggering. Scout wasn't just Silas's companion or even the pack's missing member. He was potentially the key to survival for an entire population of wolves struggling to adapt to a changing world. The responsibility was enormous, far beyond anything Silas had imagined when he pulled a drowning pup from floodwaters. "What you've accomplished here," Dr. Running Bear said, looking around the cabin that had become home to an impossible family, "is something my people have dreamed about for generations. True partnership between human and wolf based on mutual respect and shared purpose. But it's also just the beginning." She reached into her backpack and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting and detailed sketches. "This contains everything my grandfather learned about wolf behavior, pack dynamics, and the old ways of cooperation between our peoples. He always hoped someone would come along who could put this knowledge to use." Silas accepted the journal with trembling hands, feeling the weight of history and expectation it represented. Inside were decades of observations, traditional knowledge passed down through generations, and practical guidance for maintaining the delicate balance between wild and domestic that Scout embodied. "The choice is yours," Dr. Running Bear said as she prepared to leave. "You can continue as you have, raising Scout as your own and letting the pack maintain their protective relationship. Or you can step into something larger, help establish a formal cooperation between the pack and the human community. Use Scout as proof that coexistence is possible." As she walked away into the pre-dawn darkness, Silas sat with Scout beside him and contemplated the true magnitude of what had begun with a simple act of rescue. His son's final kindness had echoed across 15 years to bring healing to a broken father's heart. Now that same kindness was asking him to step beyond personal comfort and become part of something that could change the future for both species. The mountains had revealed their deepest secret, that love and honor could transcend the boundaries between human and animal, between past and present, between individual loss and collective hope. The question now was whether one old trapper had the courage to honor that revelation with action that would honor his son's memory in ways he'd never imagined possible. Scout looked up at him with those ember eyes that carried the wisdom of the wild and the trust of the tame, waiting patiently for the decision that would shape both their futures. Outside, the adult pack maintained their vigil, guardians of a legacy that had taken 15 years to fully reveal itself. The loneliest man in Thunder Valley was about to discover that his true purpose had been waiting for him all along, disguised as a storm, a rescue, and a love that refused to acknowledge the boundaries between species. The weight of decision pressed on Silas for 3 days following Dr. Running Bear's revelation. He moved through his daily routines like a man walking underwater, every action requiring conscious effort as his mind grappled with the magnitude of what he'd learned. Scout seemed to sense the tension, staying closer than usual and watching his human companion with concerned golden eyes that carried depths of understanding no ordinary animal should possess. On the 4th morning, as November frost painted the world in crystalline beauty, Silas made his choice. He would honor his son's legacy by stepping into the larger purpose that had been waiting for him all along. But first, there were preparations to make, people to convince, and a community to educate about possibilities they'd never imagined. His first stop was Widow Crow's trading post, where he arrived with Scout walking freely beside him, no leash, no restraint except the bond of trust that had grown between them over the months. The sight of the now massive young wolf padding through the settlement like a well-trained dog caused quite a stir. But Silas had learned that dramatic gestures sometimes conveyed truths that words alone could not. Elena Crow emerged from her store as he approached, her sharp eyes taking in the changes that had transformed both man and wolf since their last visit. Scout was magnificent now, nearly full-grown with a coat that gleamed silver-gray in the morning light. But it was Silas who showed the more profound transformation, shoulders straighter, eyes brighter, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who had found his calling. "Well," Elena said with her characteristic understatement, "I see you've both been growing." Silas told her everything then. Dr. Running Bear's visit, the revelation about Tommy's connection to the pack, the larger purpose that Scout might serve as an ambassador between worlds. He spoke with the passionate conviction of a man who had discovered that his personal grief was part of a much larger story, one that could bring healing not just to himself, but to an entire ecosystem struggling to survive. Elena listened without interruption, her weathered face revealing nothing of her thoughts until he finished speaking. Then she was quiet for a long moment, studying Scout with the careful attention of someone reassessing everything she thought she knew. "Your boy would be proud," she said finally, and those simple words carried more weight than any elaborate endorsement. "What do you need from us?" The answer to that question required another week of careful planning and preparation. Silas spent hours studying Dr. Running Bear's journal, absorbing generations of wisdom about wolf behavior and pack dynamics. He practiced the communication techniques the Lakota elder had documented, learning to read the subtle body language and vocalizations that formed the basis of interspecies diplomacy. More challenging was preparing Scout for the role he would need to play. The young wolf would have to demonstrate his unique abilities to a gathering of skeptical humans while maintaining the trust and cooperation of his birth pack. It was a delicate balance that required all the training and trust they had built together over the months. Scout rose to the challenge with an intelligence that continued to astound Silas. During their practice sessions, the young wolf learned to respond to both human commands and wolf pack signals, switching seamlessly between the two communication systems as situations required. He mastered the art of controlled aggression, displaying his predatory capabilities in ways that impressed rather than threatened, showing that power and gentleness could coexist in the same creature. But perhaps most remarkably, Scout began to serve as an interpreter between Silas and the adult pack. During their evening meetings in the forest clearing, the young wolf would translate human intentions into wolf behavior and wolf responses into actions Silas could understand. It was like watching the emergence of a new language, one that could bridge the gap between species in ways that seemed almost magical. The adult wolves, for their part, seemed to understand the importance of what was being planned. Their behavior became increasingly cooperative, demonstrating hunting techniques and pack dynamics that Silas carefully documented in his own expanding notebook. The alpha male, whom Silas had begun thinking of as thunder in honor of the valley that had brought them together, showed particular patience in teaching the human observer the subtle hierarchies and communication patterns that governed wolf society. Word of the unusual partnership began to spread beyond the immediate mountain community. Dr. Running Bear returned twice, bringing colleagues who needed to see the evidence for themselves before they could believe such cooperation was possible. A wildlife photographer from National Geographic made the difficult journey to document the phenomenon, producing images that would eventually appear in magazines around the world. But it was the local response that mattered most for Silas's ultimate plan. The old-timers at Widow Crow's became his most ardent supporters, spreading word throughout the valley about the remarkable developments taking place in the high country. Jake Morrison, Pete Hawkins, and Carl Brennan took on the role of informal ambassadors, using their decades of credibility in the community to vouch for Silas's sanity and the authenticity of what they had witnessed. The breakthrough came when Elena Crow suggested hosting a demonstration at the annual Valley Heritage Festival, a gathering that brought together residents from throughout the region to celebrate their mountain culture and shared history. It would be the perfect venue to introduce the broader community to the possibilities of human-wolf cooperation, with the added benefit of familiar surroundings that might make the revolutionary concept more palatable. Preparations for the demonstration required meticulous planning. Silas and Scout would need to show their partnership in action, demonstrating not just the emotional bond between them, but the practical applications of interspecies cooperation. The adult pack would need to participate without causing panic among the human observers. A delicate balance that required careful choreography and absolute trust from all parties involved. The days leading up to the festival were filled with intensive rehearsals. Silas practiced his presentation until he could deliver it smoothly, despite the nervousness that threatened to overwhelm him whenever he thought about addressing such a large audience. Scout ran through his demonstrations repeatedly, perfecting the timing and responses that would showcase his unique abilities without triggering fear responses from the watching humans. Most challenging were the logistics of bringing the adult pack into proximity with a large human gathering. Thunder and his companions would need to remain close enough to participate in the demonstration, but far enough away to avoid causing panic. It required the construction of a carefully designed viewing area that would allow safe observation while maintaining the wolves' comfort and security. 3 nights before the festival, Silas sat in his cabin surrounded by notes, diagrams, and backup plans for every conceivable contingency. Scout lay beside him, occasionally lifting his head to offer comfort when the stress became overwhelming. Through the window, they could see the adult pack maintaining their usual vigil, patient guardians of a process that would determine the future of their kind. Saku. Irony wasn't lost on Silas that he, a man who had spent 15 years avoiding human contact, was about to step onto a stage and advocate for the most revolutionary approach to wildlife management anyone in the region had ever heard. But the memory of Tommy's final kindness, the debt of honor that stretched across 15 years and 2 species, gave him strength to face the fear tomorrow would bring the ultimate test of everything they had built together. Scout would need to prove that wolves and humans could coexist not just peacefully but productively. The adult pack would need to demonstrate that wild predators could be trusted partners rather than threats to be eliminated. And Silas would need to find the words to convince an entire community that the old ways of thinking about wildlife were not just wrong, but dangerously outdated. As he prepared for sleep that final night, Silas reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had begun with the simple act of pulling a drowning pup from floodwaters, motivated by nothing more than instinctive compassion. Now it had become something that could change the future for both species, a legacy that would honor his son's memory in ways Tommy himself could never have imagined. The mountains had prepared him for this moment through months of patient teaching, showing him that the boundaries between wild and tame were not as fixed as humans believed. Tomorrow, he would share that revelation with the world, trusting in the bond between man and wolf to prove that love and respect could overcome even the deepest evolutionary divisions. The loneliest man in Thunder Valley was about to discover that his greatest isolation had been preparation for his most important moment of connection. The morning of the Valley Heritage Festival dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline mountain air that made every detail stand out in sharp relief. Silas woke before sunrise, his stomach tight with anticipation and fear, but Scout's calm presence beside him provided an anchor of confidence that helped steady his nerves. Today would determine whether months of careful preparation would result in breakthrough or disaster. The festival grounds occupied a natural amphitheater in the lower valley, where generations of mountain families had gathered to celebrate their shared heritage and stubborn independence. By mid-morning, nearly 300 people had assembled, more than had attended any valley gathering in recent memory. Word of the unusual demonstration had spread far beyond the local community, drawing curious observers from universities, wildlife agencies, and news organizations across the region. Silas arrived early, with Scout walking calmly beside him, both of them drawing stares and whispered conversations from the gathering crowd. The young wolf had grown into a magnificent creature, his silver-grey coat thick with winter fur, and his bearing carrying the confident dignity of an animal completely comfortable in his own skin. But it was the easy partnership between man and wolf that captured the most attention, the way they moved together with unconscious coordination, communicating through subtle glances and gestures that spoke of deep, mutual understanding. Elena Crow had arranged for a raised platform at the center of the amphitheater, surrounded by carefully positioned seating that would allow clear sightlines while maintaining safe distances. Dr. Running Bear stood nearby with her team of observers, their cameras and recording equipment ready to document whatever unfolded. The atmosphere crackled with tension and expectation, as if everyone present understood they were about to witness something unprecedented. At precisely noon, Silas stepped onto the platform with Scout at his side. The murmur of conversation died instantly as 300 pairs of eyes focused on the unlikely pair. For a moment, the weight of attention threatened to overwhelm him. But then he felt Scout's warm flank pressed against his leg and remembered why they were there. 15 years ago, Silas began, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, my son Tommy died in a logging accident on the Thunder Valley Road. What most of you don't know is that he died trying to save the life of a pregnant wolf who had been struck by his truck. Tommy wrapped the surviving pup in his own jacket, spending his final moments caring for a creature that most folks would have left to die. The crowd listened in absolute silence as Silas told the full story: the rescue during the storm, Scout's recovery, the mysterious behavior of the adult pack, and finally, the revelation of the connection that stretched back to Tommy's sacrifice. He spoke simply and directly, letting the extraordinary facts speak for themselves without embellishment or interpretation. That pup Tommy saved grew up to become the alpha male of the pack that's been protecting this valley. For the past 15 years, Silas continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction, and when Scout here needed rescuing, that same pack guided me to the exact spot where I could save him. What we're dealing with isn't coincidence. It's a family debt being repaid across species and generations. As if summoned by his words, a low howl echoed from the forest surrounding the amphitheater. Scout's head lifted instantly, his ears pricked forward in response to the familiar call. The crowd stirred nervously, but Silas raised his hand for calm. That's Thunder, he said, using the name he'd given the alpha male. He and his pack are here today because they trust us enough to reveal themselves to this many humans. What I'm about to show you has never been documented before. True cooperation between wild wolves and human communities. Scout stepped forward to the edge of the platform and released his own howl, a clear, strong note that carried both greeting and invitation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 3 adult wolves emerged from the tree line and padded confidently toward the amphitheater. Several people in the crowd gasped or shifted nervously in their seats. But the wolves' calm demeanor gradually eased the initial fear. Thunder led the approach, his massive frame moving with the fluid grace of perfect predatory confidence. Behind him came the dark female Silas had learned to call Shadow, and the younger male they'd nicknamed Storm. They arranged themselves in a loose semicircle about 50 yards from the platform, close enough to participate, but far enough to avoid triggering panic responses from the human observers. What you're seeing, Silas explained, his voice steadied despite the magnitude of what was unfolding, is a wild pack, choosing to trust humans based on 15 years of evidence that we can be partners rather than enemies. They're not tame, they're not trained, they're not under human control in any conventional sense. They're making a conscious choice to engage with us as equals. To demonstrate the point, Silas gave Scout a subtle hand signal they'd practiced countless times. The young wolf immediately trotted down from the platform and approached Thunder, touching noses in the traditional wolf greeting before returning to Silas's side. The interaction was brief but profound, a creature moving seamlessly between human and wolf social systems without confusion or conflict. The crowd watched in amazed silence as Silas demonstrated the communication techniques he'd learned from Dr. Running Bear's journal. Using body language, vocal signals, and careful positioning, he engaged in what could only be described as a conversation with the adult pack. Thunder responded with subtle movements and vocalizations that Scout translated through his own actions, creating a three-way exchange that bridged species barriers with remarkable fluency. The culminating demonstration came when Silas asked the audience to remain absolutely still while he called the entire pack closer to the platform. One by one, Thunder, Shadow, and Storm approached until they were within 20 feet of the nearest human observers. The wolves showed no aggression, no fear, only a watchful alertness that suggested they were as curious about the humans as the humans were about them. "This is what's possible," Silas said, his voice filled with quiet conviction as he stood surrounded by wild predators who had chosen trust over fear. Not domination, not domestication, but partnership based on mutual respect and shared benefit. These wolves understand that their survival depends on coexistence with human communities. We need to understand that our future depends on learning to share the land with the creatures who were here first. The moment that would define everything came when a child's voice cut through the hushed silence of the amphitheater. "Mister, can I pet the big doggy?" The question came from a girl of perhaps 6 years old, standing in the front row with her grandmother's restraining hand on her shoulder. Her innocent words sent a ripple of nervous tension through the crowd, but Silas saw opportunity where others saw danger. This was the test that would prove whether the partnership he'd built with the pack could extend to the broader human community. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Silas asked gently, stepping to the edge of the platform. "Lucy," the girl replied, her eyes bright with curiosity as she looked at Thunder's magnificent form. "My grandma says wolves are scary, but he doesn't look scary. He looks sad." The child's perception cut straight to the heart of something adults had missed. Thunder did look sad, not dangerous or threatening, but melancholy in the way of creatures who had learned to expect rejection from the world around them. Lucy's grandmother tightened her grip, but the girl's fearless interest seemed to awaken something in the great wolf's amber eyes. "Lucy," Silas said carefully, "would you like to help me show everyone something very special? Something that might help both people and wolves?" Before the grandmother could object, Dr. Running Bear stepped forward. "It's safe," she said quietly, her scientific credentials carrying weight that simple reassurance could not. "I've been documenting this partnership for months. The wolves have shown remarkable gentleness with humans, especially children." Silas descended from the platform with Scout at his side, approaching the edge of the crowd where Lucy stood, bouncing with excitement. The entire amphitheater held its collective breath as he knelt to the child's level and began explaining what would happen. "Thunder is the leader of his family," Silas said, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathering. "He's very wise and very careful about who he trusts. But if Scout tells him that you're a friend, he might let you meet him properly." The interaction that followed unfolded with the careful choreography of a ritual. Scout approached Lucy first, allowing her to scratch behind his ears while he assessed her energy and intentions. The young wolf's calm acceptance served as a character reference that the adult pack could understand and trust. When Scout returned to Thunder's side and touched noses with the alpha, the message was clear. This human child posed no threat. Thunder's response exceeded even Silas's expectations. The great wolf approached slowly, his massive head lowered in the non-threatening posture that wolves used when engaging with their own young. He stopped just beyond Lucy's reach and settled into a lying position, making himself smaller and less intimidating while keeping his intelligent eyes fixed on the child's face. "He's saying, 'It's okay,'" Silas explained, his own voice thick with emotion at the unprecedented display of trust. "But you have to be very gentle, very quiet. Can you do that?" Lucy nodded solemnly, understanding instinctively that she was being offered a privilege beyond measure. Under Silas's careful guidance, she extended her small hand toward Thunder's massive head. The wolf remained perfectly still as tiny fingers touched his fur, his eyes closing briefly in what could only be described as contentment, the image of a 6-year-old girl gently petting a wild wolf while 300 adults watched in amazement. became the defining moment of the demonstration. Cameras captured the scene from every angle, but no photograph could convey the profound shift in understanding that rippled through the crowd. If a child could safely interact with these supposedly dangerous predators, what did that say about everything they thought they knew about the relationship between humans and wildlife? The success with Lucy opened the floodgates for broader engagement. Other children, emboldened by her example, asked to meet the wolves under Silas's supervision. Parents who had arrived skeptical found themselves reconsidering their assumptions as they watched their sons and daughters interact peacefully with creatures they'd been taught to fear, but it was the response from the adult community that truly validated Silas's vision. Jake Morrison, the gruff old miner who'd spent 40 years cursing wolves for taking his deer, stood up and asked a question that changed the entire conversation. "Silas, if these wolves can help us understand the land better, teach us things we've forgotten about living in harmony with the mountains, what would that partnership look like in practical terms?" The question opened the door for the serious discussion that Silas had hoped to achieve. Over the next hour, he outlined the possibilities that Dr. Running Bear's research had revealed: wolves as partners in ecosystem management, helping to control deer populations that damaged forestry regeneration, serving as early warning systems for environmental changes, even assisting in search and rescue operations through their superior tracking abilities. The pack participated in each demonstration with remarkable intelligence and patience. Thunder showed how wolves could track specific scents across vast distances, following a trail that humans couldn't detect to locate a lost volunteer who had hidden in the forest hours earlier. Shadow demonstrated the pack's ability to communicate across miles through howl patterns that carried complex information about territory, weather, and potential threats. Most impressively, a scout served as a living bridge between the two species, translating human requests into wolf behavior and wolf responses into actions humans could understand. When Silas asked the pack to show their hunting coordination, Scout communicated the request through subtle body language and vocalizations. The resulting demonstration of pack tactics was both beautiful and educational, showing how wolves could control prey movement without actually harming any animals. As the afternoon wore on, the mood of the gathering shifted from skeptical curiosity to genuine enthusiasm. Questions became more practical and forward-looking. How could similar partnerships be established in other communities? What legal frameworks would need to change to accommodate cooperative relationships with wild predators? How could traditional hunting and ranching operations adapt to include wolves as partners, rather than viewing them as competitors? Elena Crow, who had been watching the proceedings with her characteristic sharp-eyed assessment, finally stood and addressed the crowd. 40 years I've been running that trading post, she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades in the mountain community. 40 years of listening to folks complain about wolves taking livestock, threatening children, disrupting the natural order. Today, I've seen a 6-year-old girl pet a wild wolf and walk away giggling. Maybe it's time we admitted we've been looking at this all wrong. The endorsement from the valley's most respected merchant carried enormous weight. One by one, other community leaders stood to voice their support for exploring the possibilities that Silas and his remarkable partners had revealed. Even the local ranchers, traditionally the most opposed to wolf conservation, acknowledged that cooperation might serve their interests better than the costly and ultimately futile efforts to eliminate predator populations. As the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the amphitheater, Silas found himself surrounded by people eager to learn more about building bridges between human and wolf communities. The transformation was complete. The loneliest man in Thunder Valley had become the center of a movement that could reshape the relationship between civilization and wilderness. But perhaps the most profound moment came as the formal demonstration concluded, and the crowd began to disperse. Thunder approached the platform one final time, looking directly at Silas with those amber eyes that carried the wisdom of the wild. In that gaze, the old trapper saw acknowledgement, gratitude, and something that looked remarkably like hope. The debt that had begun with Tommy's sacrifice 15 years ago had been repaid in full. Now it was time to build something new, a future where the boundaries between wild and tame, human and animal, fear and trust could be bridged by understanding, respect, and the kind of love that recognized no limits. 6 months after the Valley Heritage Festival, Silas stood on his porch watching the morning sun paint Thunder Valley in shades of gold and amber. The world had changed in ways both subtle and profound, but the mountains themselves remained constant, ancient witnesses to the cycles of loss and renewal that defined all life in the high country. Scout, now fully mature at nearly 2 years old, lay stretched across the porch planks with the easy confidence of a creature completely at home in his skin. His coat had deepened to the rich silver grey of his father Thunder, and his bearing carried the quiet authority of an animal who had found his purpose in bridging two worlds that had been separated for too long. The changes in the valley were visible everywhere Silas looked. New trail markers dotted the landscape, part of the cooperative management system that allowed wolves and humans to share territory without conflict. Research stations established by Dr. Runningbear's team provided ongoing monitoring of both wildlife populations and human activities, ensuring that the delicate balance they'd achieved could be maintained over time. Most remarkably, the Thunder Valley Wolf Sanctuary had been established in the lower meadows, serving as both a research facility and educational center, where visitors from around the world could learn about successful human-wildlife cooperation. The sanctuary wasn't about keeping wolves in captivity. It was about providing a safe space where wild packs could interact with humans on their own terms, building understanding that had already spread to dozens of other communities facing similar challenges. Silas had become something he'd never expected or wanted to be, a celebrity of sorts, whose story had been featured in magazines and documentaries that reached audiences far beyond the mountain valleys he called home. But fame sat uneasily on his shoulders, and he much preferred the quiet satisfaction of daily work with the pack that had become his extended family. Thunder and his pack now ranged freely throughout the expanded territory. That included both wilderness areas and human settlements. Their presence had brought unexpected benefits. Deer populations that had been overgrazing regeneration areas were now naturally controlled. Illegal hunting operations had been virtually eliminated by wolves, who served as the most effective patrol system ever devised. And tourism revenue from wolf-watching expeditions had revitalized communities that had struggled economically for decades. The old trading post had evolved into something Elena Crow could never have imagined when she first listened to Silas's impossible story. Now it served as headquarters for the Mountain Partnership Project, connecting ranchers, researchers, and conservationists in collaborative efforts that honored both traditional ways of life and ecological balance. Elena herself had become something of an expert on interspecies diplomacy, hosting delegations from around the world who came to learn from the Thunder Valley model. But perhaps the most meaningful changes were the personal ones. Silas found himself once again part of a community, no longer the isolated hermit who had haunted these ridges for 15 years, but a respected elder whose wisdom was sought on matters ranging from wildlife management to conflict resolution. The loneliness that had defined his existence since Tommy's death had been replaced by purpose and connection that honored his son's memory in ways both profound and practical. He still missed Martha and Tommy with an ache that would never fully heal, but that grief had been transformed from a weight that crushed hope into a foundation that supported new growth. Their photographs still graced his mantle, but now they shared space with images of Scout, Thunder, and the countless visitors who had found their way to his door seeking understanding about the possibilities of cooperation across species lines. The morning routine that had once marked the passage of empty days now buzzed with purpose and activity. Correspondence from researchers, invitations to speak at conferences, reports from other communities, attempting to replicate the Thunder Valley success. All of it passed through the cabin that had once been a refuge from the world, but had become a center for changing it. Scout stirred from his morning nap and padded over to where Silas sat in his old chair, now worn smooth by years of shared contemplation. The wolf pressed his massive head against the man's leg in a gesture of affection that never failed to stir wonder in Silas's chest. 2 years of constant companionship had only deepened the bond between them, creating a partnership that scientists were still struggling to fully understand. A soft howl from the forest announced the arrival of the day's first visitors, not human tourists or researchers this time, but thunder and shadow, with news of the pack's expanding territory. Their latest success involved a neighboring valley where conflicts between ranchers and wolves had been transformed into cooperation through careful application of the lessons learned in Thunder Valley. As Scout answered his parents' call, and the 3 wolves engaged in the complex communication that had become routine, Silas reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. It had begun with the simplest of impulses, the need to save a life that was in danger, and had grown into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between civilization and wilderness. Dr. Running Bear's prediction about Scout serving as an ambassador between worlds had proven prophetic beyond even her expectations. The young wolf had not only bridged the gap between human and animal communities, but had inspired a new generation of conservationists who understood that protection and partnership were not mutually exclusive. Concepts letters arrived weekly from children around the world who had been inspired by Scout's story to pursue careers in wildlife biology, environmental science, and what was now being called collaborative conservation. The little girl, Lucy, who had been the first to pet thunder at the festival, had become something of a junior ambassador herself, speaking to school groups about overcoming fear through understanding and respect. But as meaningful as these broader impacts were, it was the daily moments of connection that mattered most to Silas. The evening conversations with Scout by the fireplace, where the wolf's responses to his musings seemed to carry wisdom beyond animal instinct. The pre-dawn hunts with the full pack, where he had learned to move through the forest with the silent efficiency of a predator while never losing his essential humanity. The quiet satisfaction of watching fearful visitors transform into advocates through direct experience of the trust and intelligence that wolves were capable of sharing. As the morning advanced and the first tour groups began their hike up from the valley, Silas prepared for another day of sharing the story that had become his life's work. But first, he wanted a few more minutes of the peace that these mountains had given him, not the empty peace of isolation he had once sought, but the rich tranquility that came from knowing his place in the larger web of relationships that connected all living things. Thunder appeared at the edge of the clearing, magnificent in the morning light, and fixed those amber eyes on the man who had become family through the mysterious alchemy of trust and time. In that gaze, Silas saw acknowledgement of debts paid and new obligations accepted, recognition that the circle begun by his son's sacrifice had closed, only to open into larger possibilities that neither species could achieve alone. The loneliest man in Thunder Valley had discovered something that would echo through generations to come, that love could indeed bridge any divide, that kindness always found its way back to those who offered it freely, and that sometimes the greatest healing came not from forgetting old wounds, but from transforming them into wisdom that could prevent new ones. As Scout returned from his morning conference with the pack and settled beside his human father for whatever adventures the day might bring, Silas smiled and opened his door to welcome the world that had been waiting for him all along. The mountains had kept their promise. They had shown him how to live again, not in spite of his losses, but because of them, turning sorrow into strength and isolation, into connection that would endure long after the last echo of his story had faded from these ancient peaks. Outside, Thunder Valley stretched toward the horizon in all its wild beauty, home now to wolves and humans who had learned that survival was not a competition but a collaboration, and that the future belonged to those wise enough to understand that they were all part of the same family under the vast mountain sky.